Hello. This week we are going to be talking about a few things that are key concepts or themes that will help guide us through the course and some foundational knowledge that we'll need for the rest of the semester. When we talk about social construction, what we mean is that there is no inherent or necessary way for that thing, whatever it is, to be. And so if we think about construction as a metaphor, right? So when you're constructing a building, there's a lot of different ways that a building can look and can have different numbers of floors, and it can have different numbers of rooms, and it can be different style. And when you construct it, you are building it piece by piece. So using that metaphor when we say something is socially constructed means that, for example, the way that we understand sexuality, there's no inherent or absolute way for that to look. It could look a lot of different ways. For example, the way that in most of US culture we understand sexual orientation is we think about what gender the person is and what sort of gender or type of person is they are attracted to, and then we label them accordingly as gay or lesbian or heterosexual or straight, or they may label themselves in some way. That is not the only way that we could understand sexuality. That is the result of lots and lots of history and decisions and power and privilege that have built those things up in a way that they are so that we understand them in the moment. To say that something is socially constructed really means sort of three things. One, that this understanding is contextual. It differs across space and time. So if we're thinking about sexual orientation, the way that we understood sexual orientation, or the way that we understand it now in the United States or in Indianapolis or wherever it is that you are, might be different than the way that sexuality is understood in Russia or in Senegal or in India or Bangladesh. But it also means that it could differ. The way that we understand sexuality is very different potentially now in the early 2000s or the 2020s than it was in 1820 or 1620 or even earlier. So the idea that these things are perhaps different regarding the way that we understand these things are different depending on where you are at a current historical moment or a physical geographical location or what place you hold in society. To say something is socially constructed also means that it is fluid and that it is not fixed. So the meaning is always changing and evolving, and that the way we understand these things may change very quickly. So for example, on social media, there's a lot of different, or in culture right now in general, there are a lot of different terms and labels for sexual orientations that are being thought up and used and disseminated, and it feels sometimes like the language changes very quickly. Other times, the way that something is socially constructed might change a little bit more slowly, and it might be very difficult to see how that meaning is changing. But for the most part, this way that we understand concepts is changing and evolving and becoming more nuanced or being understood in different ways as time and history progresses. The third thing about socially constructed ideas or concepts is that they are non-teleological, and that is just a really fancy word that means there's no predetermined endpoint. So the meaning of these things like sexuality is not evolving in a way that there is a goal or an endpoint that we know about. It's not like a board game. Like you're not playing Chutes and Ladders where there's a goal or an end space that you're trying to get to. It's a little bit more evolutionary in that it evolves and it changes, but the end point is not predetermined. So that's what that non-teleological word means. So if something is socially constructed, again, it means it's contextual, it's fluid, and it's non-teleological, the meaning of that thing. So when we think about sex and sexuality, what gets defined as what is sex or what is appropriate sex or what is appropriate in terms of sexuality is due potentially in a large part in terms of who gets to actually do the defining and who has the power or authority to be able to define those things. To some extent, we all contribute to the definitions as part of living in society and the conversations, but certain people or organizations or institutions have more influence over how these things get defined. So those of us in this class could all get together and agree that we want to define sex in a particular way and say, great, we're going to do that. But then once we move outside of our group, we wouldn't necessarily have the power, influence, or authority to be able to enforce that. Whereas if something like the federal government, like the Justice Department or the Education Department decides here's how we define sex and or sexuality, then that institution may have a wider influence and more power over how you would define those things. So in other words, things like sex and sexuality are contested topics because they are socially constructed. And so the definitions or the meanings around what is normal or legitimate is not universally agreed upon and is always undergoing a process of contestation. So people are disagreeing or arguing or conversing over what it is that these things mean. And that process of debate and contestation is often just as important sociologically, or even more so than the actual outcome or the definition of what those things are. An example, to give another example of this, to think about how we define sex, the chart that is on the slide there are responses from a survey that was actually done by by Indiana University and the Kinsey Institute down in Bloomington. And so basically they called a bunch of people in Indiana up on the telephone and they asked them if ask them the question, if the most intimate thing you had done was whatever it is that is on this chart, would you say that you had had sex with someone? So would you say that you had had sex if the most intimate thing that you had done was manual genital stimulation? So using your hands to stimulate somebody's genitals. So if you had performed that behavior, or if you had received that behavior. What about if it was oral genital, or mouth to genital stimulation, whether you were performing that or receiving it, and on down the list, thinking about penile vaginal intercourse, penile anal intercourse, and for those two acts with some clarifying, like what if there was no ejaculation? What if there was no female orgasm? What if it was only very brief? What if there was a condom involved? And so they asked these questions to all these different people, and they said yes or no. So yes, I do think that penile vaginal intercourse with no ejaculation, yes, I would say I had had sex if I had done that with someone. And so the numbers in the second column are the percentages of respondents who answered, yes, I think this is sex. And you can see some of the more details about the sample of folks that responded. And so we know that by looking at the numbers that there is some distinction of what people define as sex. The most, even if we look at like penile vaginal intercourse, which often gets put up as like the most basic and obvious thing of we had sex, we had penile vaginal intercourse, only 94.8% of people said yes to that. So some of the people that responded to the survey said, no, I don't think that's sex. And there's some differing percentages for various levels of whether or not there was ejaculation, right? So for example, if there was no ejaculation, only 89.1% of people decided that that was sex, and so on. So you can take a look at some of these numbers, but basically what this chart sort of shows is that even among this range, this small sample of, about 500 people, there's potentially some significant disagreement about whether or not something counts as sex. Socialization Socialization, which is another concept that will be very important to our course, is basically a process through which we learn how to think, feel, and act in ways that are appropriate to a social group. And the three sort of pieces of socialization we might look at. So what is the context? So where is this happening? Who's involved? What's the situation? We also look at the content and the processes of that socialization. So what is being taught and how is it being taught? And then what are the results? Did this person learn that? Did they begin to act in a different way? Was it effective? That sort of thing. So socialization or social learning, so socialization is basically a fancy word to say social learning, can be either implicit or explicit. So an example of like explicit socialization would be a parent or somebody telling you to not have sex until you're married. So that would be a very explicit, direct, here's a thing that we think is appropriate in terms of sexuality for our social group. Whether that is a religious affiliation or a family group or whatever it is. A more implicit example of socialization would be somebody who says something like, oh, gross, they did that? They did that together? Ew. And so while there's no explicit or really direct, like don't do this or do this, it's pretty clear that the lesson or the sentiment you're meant to get from that is to not do whatever it is that they did, that is gross and unacceptable. And if you're gonna do it, you definitely should not do it with another person. So socialization isn't always verbal. Sometimes it can be nonverbal. It can be that look that your parent gives when when you're about to do something they don't think you should do or they don't like that you did. It can be situational. It can be all sorts of things, but not just verbal instructions. We actually learn about how to do things through a variety of mechanisms. One of the dominant theories of socialization in terms of sexuality comes from some academics, Simon and Gagnon. And if you're interested in hearing more about this, there's some additional reading available to you that is optional. But they came up with this idea of sexual scripting theory. And basically, this is like using the metaphor of a script like you would have for a play or a television show as a way to learn how to navigate social situations. So we could imagine a sexual script for like trying to pick someone up in a bar, and it might look like something like person A coming over and say, hey, can I buy you a drink? And then person B might respond and say, oh yeah, thanks. And then the script would then unfold similarly to the way that you might see in a film or a TV show, but that we have these sort of scripts that we draw on for everyday life. The question behind that is sort of where do these scripts come from? And they come from a variety of places. We might learn these scripts from family members, from school, from the media, from other social institutions like religious institutions or the government. But this idea that we have these sort of prepackaged scripts that many of us draw on in our daily interactions with people. And script theory is not just applicable to sexuality. We can think about script theory in terms of like greetings, right? The sort of automatic script that you follow when somebody says hello to you, or how to have particular types of conversations. And finally, when we're thinking about socialization, we know that when socialization has been very effective, we often begin monitoring ourselves. So socialization is not always externally imposed. Often it is an external factor from the beginning, especially like with young children. You know, if you have very small children, they have not always been properly or effectively socialized, and so they might say things or do things that make people uncomfortable because the rest most of us have been socialized out of those behaviors. But when socialization becomes very effective, we often begin monitoring ourselves. So we don't even need other people around to know when something is appropriate or inappropriate. And that specific process is a process of internalization. So that's that sort of inner monologue that many of us have that says, "Oh, I shouldn't do that," or "Oh, that was not that's not an appropriate way to behave," or "I feel uncomfortable now." A lot of that inner monologue really comes from that process of socialization having been internalized to ourselves. Finally, I want to talk about social control, and really ultimately at its core, socialization is also a mechanism for social control. So if we're socializing or teaching people about what is appropriate behavior, then we're also saying that, implicitly saying that you should do that appropriate behavior and not act in a way that is inappropriate. So this idea that particular understandings around sexuality or sexual orientation or sexual practices may be seen as good or normal or bad or abnormal, the way in which the world then incentivizes good behavior or tries to make bad behavior or abnormal behavior less desirable, and how effective that may or may not be. We'll also look at how society can encourage this through things like social institutions and the media and government and politics and religion and a lot of other social forces. So the social control takes place both at the definitional stage of what is good and bad, but also at the incentivizing stage to get people to act in certain ways. And finally, in terms of social control, we'll also look at how social institutions use sex and sexuality to exert control over various populations of people. So whether that is using sex and desire and pleasure to encourage folks to act in a particular way, or by perhaps more overtly exerting control over various populations who might identify as part of a sexual minority or engage in behaviors that are seen as bad or abnormal by society.